you again for giving me the privilege of speaking. You remember last time I spoke about baskets. I'm still into baskets, and you wouldn't believe it. But about 2 weeks after I'd spoken last time about Moses, and I really, really wanted a Moses basket for that service, and I didn't have one, couldn't get one. And 2 weeks later, we were in Martin, because our children go to school there, our grandchildren go to school there, and there was this church opportunity shop. And I'm quite addicted to opportunity shops and charity shops. And so I went in, and there was nothing that I wanted or needed. And I literally walked up and sort of out and said to Warwick, there's nothing here that I need or want. And then I just looked over there and I saw it, a real Moses basket, woven out of harakeke. And it was big, like it was like this big and this deep. And it was only $3. And I said to Warwick, first of all, I said to the lady, I needed that weeks ago. And I looked at Warwick and he rolls his eyes, because that's what he does. He just rolls his eyes and thinks, oh no. And he said, well, what are you going to do with it? I said, I don't know, but for $3 I've got to have it. So the basket still hasn't got a use. But it will be useful one day for something. So I'm going to carry on the theme of baskets. But this time, we're going to be looking in the book of John. So last time we had an Old Testament story. This morning we've got a New Testament. And I've entitled this sharing, Lord, here is my basket. And just for a minute, I want to imagine yourselves with a basket in your hands, and you're going to give it to Jesus. It can be any size, shape, colour, made out of anything you like. But just visualise that basket, and then as we go through, you can think of things that you can put in it that we can offer God. Right. So, this morning I want us to watch the people that John tells us about in the verses that we. And by the way, sorry, I should have said spelling. We're not going to have the Bible reading now. I'm going to introduce, and then Alan's going to bring it up in a minute. But we're going to be people watchers. And the text you're going to hear is important, but it's very, very familiar. In fact, it's one of the most beloved stories in the Bible. You will have all heard of it when you were little, and you've probably seen it on flannel graphs. You've seen it in children's picture books. There's pictures of this event, and I'm referring to the story known as the feeding of the 5,000. And I know that a lot of you will be very, very familiar with the story, as I am. But I want to share it in a different way. And now I'm going to ask Alan. Oh, hang on. I want to look at the story in a different way, a way that I believe God can help us see new things, truths that we've never seen in the story before. And this story must contain important truth we must not miss, because it's the only miracle that God inspired all four gospel writers to include in their accounts. And I think it's great that Matthew, Mark, Luke and John each include this story, but in ways that bring out the part of the story that spoke to them personally. For example, Matthew and Luke are most interested in the miracle itself, because they tell of how Jesus multiplied the 5 loaves and 2 fish without much embellishment. Mark, on the other hand, focuses on the compassion of Jesus, stressing that Jesus fed the multitude out of his great love. And finally, in John's account, the telling revolves around the historical significance of the event. John also stresses that Jesus himself is the bread of life, and this is in verses 35 to 40. Because only in a relationship with Jesus will we be satisfied. I'm going to ask Alan to come up now, please, and read.
Jesus feeds 5,000 men. After this, Jesus went across Lake Galilee, or Lake Tiberias as it was also called. A large crowd followed him because they had seen his miracles of healing those who were ill. Jesus went up a hill and sat down with his disciples. The time for the Passover festival was near. Jesus looked round and saw that a large crowd was coming to him. So he asked Philip, Where can we buy enough food to feed all these people? He said this to test Philip. Actually, he already knew what he would do. Philip answered, "For everyone to have a little, it would take more than 200 silver coins to buy enough bread." Another of his disciples, Andrew, who was Simon Peter's brother, said, "There is a boy here who has 5 loaves of barley bread and 2 fish, but they will certainly not be enough for all these people." "Make the people sit down," Jesus told them. There was a lot of grass there. So all the people sat down. There were about 5,000 men. Jesus took the bread, gave thanks to God, and distributed it to the people who were sitting there. He did the same with the fish, and they all had as much as they wanted. When they were all full, he said to his disciples, "Gather the pieces left over. Let us not waste any." So they gathered them all up and filled 12 baskets with the pieces left over from the 5 barley loaves, which the people had eaten.
So, we're going to study this familiar story by watching the people in it. Let me try and give you a mental picture of the setting. As John says in verse 1, this miraculous feeding occurred after these things. And those 3 words represented anywhere from 6 months to a year. There were many events in our Lord's ministry which took place between chapter 5 of John, chapter 5, verse 47, and chapter 6, verse 1. That's the period from Matthew 4:12 to Matthew 14:12. I mean, as soon as the word got out that Jesus was in the area, people would pour in from everywhere. They would do this all hours of the day and night. So if Jesus wanted to be alone with his disciples, he had to be very intentional about it. And being alone with them was important because only 1 year remained before Calvary, and Jesus had much to teach his disciples in that time. Plus, Jesus needed rest. He was under continuous strain to the demands of the crowds, and so were his disciples. Mark's gospel tells us they'd just returned from an extensive preaching tour of their own. So in short, Jesus and his little band needed rest. They needed to get away, which should help us to see the importance of our own times of need of solitude and rest. Jesus says, I'm getting confused here. John says, because so many people were coming and going, Jesus and his disciples did not even get a chance to eat. And so Jesus said to them, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." That could be Jesus talking to us. Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest. Mark 6:31. Well, that's what's happening in the first 3 verses of our passage. Jesus was taking his followers away for a much-needed retreat of sorts. John tells us that Jesus went over the Sea of Galilee, heading for a part of the shoreline that was fairly remote and desolate, a place where they could go and not be disturbed. But, as the text also says, the crowds which had followed him up the shoreline as he departed were very persistent. They apparently stood there and watched after he'd sailed off to see exactly where he landed, and then they followed him by walking around the top of the shoreline. Luke's gospel tells us that Jesus was making for a region which would mean that the people walked 9 miles to get to where he was. And I even asked Warwick how far 9 miles is, but I figure it's a long way. Well, it wasn't long after Jesus and his crew beached the boat, climbed the hillside, and began their little retreat. And it wasn't long before they looked up and saw the dust cloud on the horizon that they found out the multitude had followed them. But Jesus wasn't angry at their persistence. No, he was compassionate and empathetic. His first thought wasn't about his own weariness, but that of the crowd. He knew that they would be tired and hungry after their long walk. After all, by this time it was past the middle of the afternoon, and the people would not have eaten since breakfast. Now, with all that in mind, let's look at this familiar story from the perspective of being people watchers. I don't know about you, but I like watching people in airports, train stations, anywhere really. We're just sitting and you watch people. What can we learn from this miracle? We're going to stand back and take a closer look at the people involved. Number one, the first person I want to zoom in on and watch is not an individual, but a group. So let's take a closer look at that huge crowd. To be accurate, in verse 2, John calls this not a crowd, but a great multitude. And that wasn't an exaggeration. This was a large group of people. Verse 10 says there were about 5,000 men, but Matthew 14:21 gives the best tally when he says, and they that had eaten were about 5,000 men, beside women and children. That means that there was somewhere between 15 and 20,000 people there. When you think about it, it's just about, I suppose, the population of Masterton. And as I said, it was getting late, and all those thousands of people were tired from their journey, and they were very hungry. Now, when we think of hunger, it's not actually a great big deal for us. We're blessed. We eat 3 meals a day and in between as well. But hunger, genuine hunger, was the constant companion of these people. It was the enemy that they were constantly struggling to keep at bay. I mean, harvests were uncertain, and usually there was not enough or not a lot to eat. These people knew what it was like to be really hungry. So as they climbed up the hillside, these people were in need of more than a snack. I think they kept following Jesus instead of stopping to get food because they'd seen him do miracles. They knew he could fill their stomachs. They had seen his power. So they doggedly followed him with growling stomachs and blister-covered feet. They were looking for what they could get out of the Lord. They might have been following Jesus, but they were looking out for themselves at the same time. In short, this was a large crowd of, Jesus, I'm following you to see what I can get out of it kind of people. I say this because John tells us that after Jesus miraculously filled their stomachs, he had to withdraw from them because they wanted to seize him and make him their king by force. They wanted Jesus for their own purposes. They were looking for a Messiah who would be a king and a conqueror, who would not only put food in their bellies, but also drive the Romans out of Palestine. They wanted a ruler who would change the status of Israel to a world power. They wanted Jesus for what he could do for them. But if we look away from the crowd now and look at ourselves, and I'm including myself in that, I'm sure we can all see a time when we were like that. Most of the time when we go to Jesus in prayer, it's to get. We need his help, we need his strength and his guidance. Don't get me wrong, Jesus encourages us to ask for his help. But if that's all we do in our walk, it's a little bit one-sided. When we wake in the morning, our prayer should be, God, take my life and use it today. How many more people would experience God's love through the compassionate actions of Christ followers if we all focused on giving to Jesus instead of getting from him? The second person I want us to watch in the story is Philip. So put yourself back in the setting again and back up a bit. Jesus and his disciples were sitting on the grassy hillside overlooking the peaceful Sea of Galilee. They were having their retreat. There's a gentle breeze blowing off the lake and the water's gently lapping the shore. Things are quiet and peaceful. And then they look down the hill and they see this throng of people coming. John 1:44 tells us that Philip was from that region, and maybe because of that, Jesus looks over at him and says, Well, here they come. What are we going to do, Philip? What would you advise? Now, Jesus didn't ask this question because he didn't know what to do. John reminds us that Jesus' questioning was part of his plan. He asked Philip as a test. Probably the best answer Philip could have given was, well, I don't know, Jesus, but what do you think we ought to do? But Philip didn't do that, did he? No. Instead, he engaged his brain in an attempt to answer the question himself. Now, of course, different people have different kinds of brains, don't they? Now, some people have philosophical brains, and they like to take everything to a deep level. Some people have dramatic brains. They get all melodramatic and poetical about everything. And some people have mathematical brains. That is not me. They make good engineers and accountants. And that's the kind of brain that I think Philip had. Look how he answered Jesus' question. He said, 8 months' wages wouldn't buy enough bread for each one to have a bite. That's the mental image that his brain gave him. It calculated the size of the crowd and the cost of the bread and came to the conclusion, huge multitude, 1 bite per person, cost 200 denarii. Basically, Philip was saying, Jesus, I know that at Cana you turned water into wine. I know you healed the nobleman's son. I know you made the paralysed man walk. But there are 20,000 empty stomachs out there, and we just don't have the funds necessary to feed all those people. Even if we completely drain our accounts, we'd only have enough to give them a scrap of bread each. Philip was being practical. He was being a realist. He saw the number of people. He saw the amount of money, and it couldn't be done. So now let's stop looking at Philip and look at ourselves. Are we ever that way? How many times do we refuse to attempt great things for God because we don't factor in how great God really is? Could it be that Jesus is testing us as he tested Philip? Is he calling you and me to do something that's beyond our resources? Something that will force us to rely on his power and his provision? Let's move on. The third person we want to watch is Andrew. Andrew is always introduced as Peter's brother. People would say, here's Andrew, and the reply would be, Andrew who? Oh, you know, Peter's brother. Oh, him. Look at verses 8 and 9 where it says, another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. But how far will they go among so many? Now, this boy did not present himself out of thin air. Andrew had to go looking for him. And we know that Andrew was good at that sort of thing, because every time we read him about in the Bible, he's finding people who need to be brought to Jesus. That's what Andrew does. He hears Jesus asking Philip about how they can get enough food to feed this crowd, and he heads off into the crowd looking for people who have food. But out of all those thousands of people, the only one that Andrew could find with any food is a young boy whose mum wouldn't let him leave home without his lunchbox. Now, I know that Andrew's statement in verse 9 doesn't appear to have much more faith than Philip's, but Andrew does go a step further. He says, Philip basically said, this situation's hopeless. Andrew said, well, I'll see what I can do and I'll just trust Jesus for the rest. So he found this little boy and brought him and his little lunch to Jesus. And that's the principle in this familiar story that we simply must see. We will never know what will happen when we bring someone to Jesus. God can take any life and do a miracle with it, even today, like he did with that little boy Andrew brought. And that leads to one more person we need to watch in this story, and it's the star of the story, the boy with his lunch. Lord, here's my basket. The lad. 4 important words describe this young lad. Unknown, unheard, unseen and unselfish. So look with me at this little lad whom Andrew found. This kid who brought his lunch to Jesus, and don't imagine he was a big eater. No. Those loaves were small, about the size of a small pancake, and the fish were really more like small sardines. Fish that were typically used as a spread to give the barley loaves some flavour. And speaking of barley bread, it was the cheapest of all the bread of the day. Most people turned their noses up at it. Barley bread was the bread of the very poor. This little boy was carrying the lowest quality bread available to people at that day. You know, it wasn't a casual thing for this boy to gather up his food that day, but he did. This little boy wasn't like the crowd trying to get something out of Jesus. He wasn't like Philip calculating ways that were going to work. No, he simply brought everything he had to Jesus. He did not have much to offer, but out of what he had, Jesus found the materials to make a miracle happen. Someone raised this child right. They taught him the importance of sharing. Now, here's the lesson that we can learn from this miracle. Christ wants us to bring what we can bring to him. Little is always much in God's hands. Nothing is insignificant when it is in God's hands. And this truth is seen throughout the Bible. What is as insignificant as dust? Nothing. Crops don't even grow in dust. But dust became a man in God's hands. And what about the jawbone of an axe? It's pretty insignificant. But God used it in the hands of Samson to kill 1,000 soldiers of the army of the enemies of Israel. How about a shepherd's rod? That's pretty insignificant. But it became powerful when God put it into the hands of Moses. I love this one. A little boy's sling. Pretty unimportant, insignificant. But God used it to kill a giant. And God took a poor peasant girl named Mary to bring the Redeemer into our world. So we must never make the mistake of thinking that what we have is insignificant and useless. Well, you know the rest of the story. Jesus had the disciples seat the people. Now that exact wording he used was, have them recline, because that's how they ate in those days. Not up at a table with a chair and a knife and fork like we do. Have them recline, because that's how you sat when you got ready to eat back then. So this was a position of expectation. So if they're reclining, they're expecting something. But before the miracle, Jesus gave thanks, and that's a principle of gratitude that we obviously should adopt. And I'm sure that most of us would give thanks before a meal. Afterwards, he began to break those barley bread and the fish in half again and again and again and again, passing it to the disciples who passed it to the people. Must have gone on for quite some time, if you think about it, 20,000 people. I wonder what the expression on the little boy's face was. Did he think, hey, hang on a minute, Mum only packed 5 loaves, where's all this coming from? And I thought she gave me 2 fish, only 2 fish, and that's, gee, imagine his face. Jesus kept pulling out and off more and more until the people experienced something they rarely experienced, full stomachs. John's wording literally means glutted or fed to the limits of their stomach capacity. In other words, they were stuffed. They couldn't eat another bite. Then, when they'd finished eaten their fill, Jesus asked the disciples to take the baskets that they'd used to carry their luggage and gather up the fragments that were left. And when they were done, they had 12 baskets full of leftovers. God's saying to us, listen, you take care of the addition and I'll handle the multiplication. You bring me what you have and I'll do a miracle with it. Be like this little boy. Bring me your little, because with me it is always much. As we have watched the main characters in the story, we need to watch ourselves. Who are we most like? Am I? Are you? The crowd? Looking for what we can get out of Jesus? Maybe we're more like Philip. We know what Jesus is asking us to do, but we think realistically and conclude, no, there's no way. It just doesn't add up. We should all be like the little boy. We should be turning everything over to Jesus. This is about our lives and Jesus being Lord of every part of it. It could mean saying yes to something God has asked us to do, something that's beyond our capacities. We respond with, I don't have the resources necessary to do this, but what I have is yours, God. Take it and multiply it for your glory. Do you remember what Jesus did back in verse 5 when he saw the crowds coming? He looked over to Philip and basically said, you know what needs to be done. What are you going to do about it? And that could very well be Jesus' question to us. You know what needs to be done. What are you going to do about it? Now, I did talk about at the beginning, I said visualise a basket of some sort, anything in your hand, that we would say, Lord, this is the basket. Well, because I like hands-on things, I have to confess, I went and bought another basket. It was from the trade aid shop, so I guess that makes it better. And it's made in Dhaka. But I'm going to put this basket somewhere special, and not just anything is going to go into this basket. I'm not sure, but I want it to be, my Lord, here is my basket. What am I offering you? What can I do for you? Instead of me constantly asking God to help this, do this, like, what can I do for you?